everyone. Welcome. Welcome to CIMMYT headquarters. And welcome to those colleagues that are joining us via Zoom. My name is Gabriela Ramirez, and it is an honor to serve as your Master of Ceremonies this afternoon. Today, we have an important scientific milestone, the launch of the 2025 EAT-Lancet Commission report on healthy, sustainable, and just food systems, the most comprehensive global scientific assessment of food systems to date. The EAT-Lancet Commission convenes leading scientists across nutrition, agricultural sciences, climate science, economics, and public health to answer a core global question. How can we nourish nearly 10 billion people by 2050 while protecting the planet and ensuring social equity? Well, today's dialogue will bring these findings to life and guide actionable pathways for society, science, and policy. Thank you for being here to take part. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to acknowledge our distinguished presidium, Ms. Daniela Vega, Chief of Staff at CIMMYT. Welcome. Dr. Fabrice de Klerk, Chief Science Officer at EAT and Principal Scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT at CGR. Dr. Six Knapp, Sustainable Agri-Food System Program Director at CIMMYT. And Dr. Santiago Lopez Ridaura, Principal Scientist, Agricultural Systems and Climate Change Adaptation at CIMMYT. Thank you, John, for joining us today. To officially open today's program, we will now play a welcome message from Dr. Sarah Hearn, Chief Science and Innovation Officer at CIMMYT.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Hearn, the Chief Science and Innovation Officer at CIMMYT. I'm delighted to share some exciting news for our global CIMMYT community. On December the 11th, Mexico City will host the national launch of the 2025 EAT-Lancet Commission report on healthy, sustainable, and just food systems. And we have the privilege of welcoming 3 of the report's co-authors here at CIMMYT the day before the auspicious event. Welcome Fabrice de Klerk, Mario Herrero, and Juan Rivera. While I'm sorry I can't be there in person, I didn't want to miss the opportunity to offer CIMMYT's sincere congratulations to all the authors of this landmark assessment. The EAT-Lancet report is one of the most influential scientific evaluations of global food systems. It brings together evidence on nutrition, environmental sustainability, climate resilience, and equity to ask a vital question. How can we feed a growing world within the limits of the planet? This systems report sounds a very clear alarm. The Commission concludes that today's food systems are breaching multiple planetary boundaries, reflecting land use and biodiversity loss, massive shifts in nitrogen and phosphorus dynamics, and unaddressed greenhouse gas emissions. These pressures threaten not only ecosystems, but human health, farmer livelihoods, and long-term food security. But the report does more than diagnose the problem. It maps out pathways for transformation, pathways that include healthier diets, climate-smart production systems, better resource governance, and innovations that reduce environmental impacts while improving nutrition and fairness. This makes the report especially important for CIMMYT because the core messages of EAT-Lancet align deeply with our mandate. Science for impact, science that protects the environment, and science that ensures healthy, secure, and dignified livelihoods for farmers, those involved in agri-food systems, and consumers alike. For decades, CIMMYT's work on climate-resilient maize and wheat, resource-efficient agronomy, cropping system diversification, and low-emissions agriculture has directly addressed the kinds of challenges the Commission highlights. We recognise that farmers are on the front line of climate and environmental pressures, and we know that the innovations we develop must be scalable, accessible, and sustainable. not only for production today, but for the ecosystems we rely on tomorrow. CIMMYT's commitment to open science, global partnerships, and public good research is precisely the kind of collaborative model the EAT-Lancet report calls for. Transforming food systems cannot be done by an institution alone. It demands cooperation across borders, across disciplines, and across institutions. This is why we're so pleased that Fabrice, Mario, and Juan will spend the afternoon of December the 10th with us, sharing insights from the new report and engaging directly with our scientists and staff. These are global leaders in food systems thinking, and their visit is an opportunity for us all to connect CIMMYT's science to the broader transformation agenda shaping food security worldwide. For colleagues in Africa and Asia, yes, the timing is late for your zones. But don't worry, we will record the seminar so that you can revisit the discussion and engage with the material at your convenience. I want to thank Santiago and all the colleagues for supporting the organization of this event. And I want to thank you for the work that you do every day, supporting and developing innovations that help farmers adapt to climate change, sustainably improve productivity, and nourish their communities and the global community at large. The EAT-Lancet report is a global call to action, and CIMMYT is already answering that call and will continue to do so as we develop new innovations. Thank you. Have a good seminar.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our invited representative of the EAT-Lancet Commission, Dr. Fabrice de Klerk. He serves as Chief Science Officer at EAT and holds a joint role as Principal Scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAD within the CGR system. He leads its scientific agenda, integrating research, synthesis, and science to policy outreach. He is also a member of the Earth Commission. Dr. de Klerk's background is rooted in agricultural and environmental sciences, with more than a decade of field experience in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. His collaborations with nutrition and health research date back to 2004, advancing evidence-based pathways, linking environmental, sustainability, diets, and well-being. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone. I mean, it's a huge pleasure to be here, but to be honest with you, I feel like I'm home with family as a peer with you in CG centers, and particularly to be here at CIMMYT, where the start of the CG system happened. And I think a lot about Norman Borlaug in terms of the challenge that he was confronted with when he started working. How do you feed a growing population? How do you do this and avert some of the crises that we were concerned about during those times? And I think that what the Lancet Commission tries to do is to rethink again, what are the urgent actions that we need today? And I think just as with Borlaug, it prevents us a way to think about the importance of the work that we collectively do with the CGIAR. And I'm absolutely convinced of the importance of that work. So looking forward to spending the afternoon with you. I'm really sorry that Mario is not here with us. His plane got turned around last night, and so he's on the plane now making his way to Mexico, but he does also send his hellos. Also someone who I think cut his teeth in the CG system and who would have loved to spend the afternoon with you here today. So I want to present the 2025 EAT-Lancet Commission. This is the second of the EAT-Lancet Commission. The first one, we published it in 2019. It was one of my first projects at EAT, maintain a dual role with CGIAR. I was, I think, blown away by the success that it had. 13,000 citations. It's in the top 1% of research publications, and it's also one of the top 10 publications cited by policy. And I think this caught us by surprise. And part of it was realizing, one, that being able to bring scientists together to do synthesis work has real value, but also I think the effort that EAT put into engagement, communications with policy, with frontline actors also were quite critical in making sure that the science didn't just sit on a shelf, but really was made accessible to people. And with that, I think in 2020, we brought several of those people here to CIMMYT, had a 4-day workshop with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development on food transitions, engaging multiple system actors. So CIMMYT does feature in the 2019 commission as well. So the objective that we had with the first commission was healthy food, accessible to all, produced, processed, distributed, and consumed fairly within planetary boundaries. And we do see this as the challenge that we're now confronted with, particularly as scientists who are deeply engaged in food systems. The 2019 commission focused on 2 major points. One, what is a healthy diet? Can we define it? Second, can we understand what the food system share the planetary boundaries are? This second commission added a new component, which was trying to understand whether it can provide justice guardrails. And you'll see justice featured throughout the work. And you see it here in this title in 3 elements at least. The first is healthy food accessible to all, which I think is something that everyone here in this room works on day in, day out. How do we make sure that food is available to all people everywhere? Second, produce, process, distribute, and consume fairly. We realize that it's a key transition that we're confronted with, that this transition is scary to many people. And how do we engage with communities, particularly those who are required to act in a way that recognize equity, fairness, that people's livelihoods, people's lands are part of that transition? And third, within planetary boundaries. You know, when I was with Laura doing PhDs in Davis, I think we talked about environmental crises, once a year there was something, and now on a weekly basis, I can pull out, the latest event, right? The floods in South and Southeast Asia last week that impacted, 1,500 people's lives lost, not to count for the economic loss. So this really, I think, calls into question, how do we bring ourselves back within planetary boundaries as a means of securing a safe environmental space for humanity? And I'll talk about those during today's presentation. This is the team that worked on this. I'm just one of the individuals here that collaborated on that work. My job at EAT is to coordinate and manage the commission. Our co-chairs are Johan Rockström, who is well known for his work on planetary boundaries, Shakuntla Tilsted, who many of you may know from World Fish, but also led CGIAR's Promoting Nutrition, and Walter Willett, who is really most known for his work in nutrition. The top line here are individuals who participated in the 2019 commission that we called back on board to help maintain consistency across the work. You'll recognize some faces here: Sonia Vermeulen, who was with us in the CGIAR, Belinda Gordon from Stockholm Resilience Center, Jess Fanzo, who also worked with us quite a bit in the CGIAR several years ago, Juan Rivera, who's helping us with this launch tomorrow and really provide key elements of nutrition, particularly for Latin America. But we also wanted to bring in some new individuals to fill in some of the gaps that we had seen from the 2019 commission. A lot of comments on livestock production. And so for that, brought in Ernia Skebrev from UC Davis, particularly working on animal emissions, Nama Kulokovic, who many of you know from ILRI, tremendous scientist with nutrition, but also livestock system, particularly in Africa. Mario Herrero, who again worked with us in the ILRI, but also as part of CCAS, who led a massive modeling effort. So CGIAR actually has the highest density of researchers in the commission of any institution. And I think one of my greatest pleasures in this commission has been able to work across centers with these collaborators. New focus on justice. Christina Hicks, Nitya Rao really drove that work. Agroecology, SIG, we've called on Claire Kremen to help us with that piece of the work. When we published the 2019 commission, a lot of the environmental impacts was tied to consumption changes. We wanted to give more attention to production side impacts as well. And then expanding, I think, the health work to recognize, I think, important work from Asia, when Harnpan, Anpan, and Carlos Monteiro's work on ultra-processed foods. So really, again, a great joy to be able to work with all of these individuals. Oops, there's a piece that got lost there, but that's all right. So the 3 elements that should be feed over the first one, care, protect, 3, I think, independent dimensions that as a commission we wanted to address. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that each of these normative guardrails that we'll talk about today, healthy diets, food system shared the planetary boundaries, social foundations, we assess each of these independently. I think a major misunderstanding of the 2019 Commission is that the healthy diet recommends that we made were adjusted based on the environmental impacts of those foods. And I just want to be clear, this is not the case. The health dimension, the health recommendations are purely based on health impacts and not weighted by environment. What we did in the modeling work then was ask the questions, what is the impact of healthy diets on environment? Then we understand this time around also independently the social justice guardrails or foundations that we want to put more attention to. So let's start with healthy diets. First of all, 4 major means of understanding healthy diets. The first one, randomized trials, just the most powerful means of understanding consumption and health, but also the most difficult, right? This requires being able to follow cohorts of individuals over decades. Many of the health risks that we're concerned with accumulate over time and become evident in people's 50s and 60s. So there's very, very little randomized trials, particularly when we're talking about many of the regions where the CGIAR works, Africa, Latin America. Second, associations with disease. Third, effects on risk factors. And then fourth, particularly when we're talking about novel foods, is how does food composition help us understand what those risks are when we reassociate them back with the randomized controlled trials. This is what we published in 2019 as the graphical image representing our assessment of healthy diets. So it's 50% of your plate covered in fruits and vegetables. This is wet weight, so that's why the volume is so large. About 30% of your diet coming from grains, particularly transition towards whole grains. And we were here in 2020. I know that many of you were beginning to also ask questions about how you reintegrate whole grains into diets. A more modest consumption of animal source foods, particularly dairy and animal source proteins. We'll talk a bit more about those. And then I think for many parts of the world, an increased consumption of plant source proteins, which again is more of a cultural habit here in Latin America, but not as much so in Europe and other places. This is the 2025 plate, and the only thing that really has changed here is the color, which makes Walter Willett a bit upset. He doesn't like this color scheme as much, but it's still the same proportion. So reevaluating the new evidence on what a healthy diet is, we find that evidence remains quite stable. If anything, there's greater evidence that what we proposed in 2019 is the best available evidence on healthy diets. We did reduce the calorie count from 2,500 calories per capita per day to 2,400 calories per capita per day. We recognize that requirement changes based on age, gender, and activity levels, and those are disaggregated in supplementary data if those are of interest to you. But then the second part, of course, is then the quality of food, and that's the distribution across the food groups. So in terms of looking at that distribution, I think the scientists like the mean values. When I speak to the public, I like to draw more attention to the ranges and parentheses. When we're talking about plant foods, so 200 to 600 grams per day of vegetables. It's 100 to 300 grams per day of fruits. Those are 2 food groups which don't have 0 values because they're fundamental to human health. 210 grams per day of whole grains, also a non-zero value one. For the tree nuts and peanuts, 0 to 75 grams per day. For the legumes, 0 to 50 grams per day. And for the starchy tubers, 0 to 100 grams per day. And here again, there are substitutions that are possible, which is why those 0 values are present. For the animal source foods, besides from dairy, where we talk about 0 to 500 grams per day of dairy, if you're talking about yogurt or cheese, you divide that by 10, so it's 0 to 50 grams per day for those foods. For the other animal source foods, I prefer using weekly values, 0 to 420 grams per week of poultry, so it's about 2 servings per week. 0 to 200 grams per week of red meat. If you're an American, that's maybe 1 hamburger. If you're Mexican, it's maybe 3 tacos. For tacos, we should come up with a taco equivalent. And fish and shellfish, 0 to 700 grams per week. That's probably one of the values that I get the most questions on. And people say, well, is that sustainable? And I just want to remind people that when we talk about the health recommendations, these are based on health outcomes, not on the environmental outcomes. So this is one where there's some important questions about where do we source those foods and also which ones we're talking about, right? Shellfish like mussels and clams, 0 nutrients, 0 feed, 0 fresh water, 0 land. probably the best example of a nature positive food. So we're not talking about 0.7 grams per week of tuna and salmon, but rather I think recognizing particularly herbivorous fish, small pelagic fish, and shellfish as important means by which you might be able to get this level of aquatic foods with lower environmental impact. But an area I think of still important research. And for the eggs, 0 to 25 grams per day, so 175 grams per week. For the foods that become particularly dangerous when they were consumed, the fat, sugars, and salt, 20 to 80 grams per day of unsaturated plant oils, 0 to 30 grams per day of added sugars. For palm and coconut oils, 0 to 8 grams per day. For lard, tallow, and butter, despite what people think in the United States, these are to be avoided, 0 to 10 grams per day. And then for sodium, less than 2,000 milligrams per day. You can think about this in servings per day for particularly the plant-based products, about 5 servings per day of fruits and vegetables, 1 to 2 servings per day of nuts, and 2 to 3 servings per day of legumes. For the animal source foods, poultry, about 2 servings per week, about 1 serving per week of red meat, and about two eggs per week. When you consider substitutions, these numbers can change. And what we do want to emphasize is the scope for flexibility. Here's one way by which we demonstrate that. So you can think about a flexitarian diet, which includes animal source proteins, pescatarian diet, vegetarian diet, or vegan diet. And of course, these aren't the 4 only categories. You mix and match in between all of these, but there are variants of each of these diets with good evidence that you can be healthy. You can be a healthy vegan and vegetarian. You can be a healthy pescatarian. You can be a healthy omnivore. So the Commission's recommendations is not that we all become vegans. The Commission's observation is that there exist healthy vegans. And this is the proportion that you would want to follow if you were going with that lifestyle. In the same way that there is good evidence that there are people who consume animal source proteins and are very healthy. So it's really again about that flexibility and choice, so long as we're thinking about proportions within distribution, total energy consumption, and managing both of those. An important, I think, result also from this work is that every step towards a healthy diet has an impact on health. If we were able to be 100% compliant, we would be able to reduce the risk of diet-related disease by 28%. But even intermediate steps have a positive impact towards health. We estimate today that if we were able to achieve a healthy diet for all, that we would avert 15 million premature deaths per year. One of our concerns when we look at current consumption is that we assess that about half the world's population struggles in one way or another to access a healthy diet, whether it's choice, whether it's economics, or whether it's lack of choice because of food environments or other. We find that number to be really quite problematic, right? 2 billion people struggling with diseases related with overweight and obesity, and a number that's rising in many parts of the world, as well as 2 billion people who are struggling with some form of malnutrition or hunger, also increasing, primarily driven by conflict and climate change. We want to emphasize, I think, another big point that was challenging when we presented 2019. This is not a monotonic, uniform diet for all, but rather it's an invitation to explore the diversity, to cherish our own cultures, as well as to enjoy, discover the cultures of others. There are ample evidence that there are dietary traditions from all parts of the world that are compatible with healthy diets. I think, we found that when Walter Willett would talk about Mediterranean diet, that the media would say the Mediterranean diet is the healthy diet and you all have to follow it. That's not at all the message. The message is this is one example, the one that we probably have the most data on, but we find equivalent examples from other parts of the world. And the commissioners right now are working on 2-day meal plans from all 28 UN regions in order to be able to, again, inspire, demonstrate, and showcase what this might look like in different parts of the world. Let me move to the second part, which is the planetary boundaries, some shares of the planetary boundaries. One, just as we proposed a reference planetary health diet, we do propose a food system share of the planetary boundaries. There's the list here. We covered all 9 planetary boundaries this time around compared to 5 in the first assessment. We do allocate 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year to food. We think that food is so fundamental to human well-being that in essence, it is exempt from a zero value. We do assume that the energy and transportation system go to fossil-free mode by 2050. We think that food systems with additional effort might be able to go further below this, but we propose this as the food system boundary for climate. The land system change one is 48 million square kilometers. I need to add an M to this figure. I keep reminding myself of this. Currently, we see 50% of the world's ecosystems remaining intact. I think the challenge for food is how do you feed 10 billion people by 2050 without conversion of remaining intact ecosystems because of their contribution to climate mitigation. For biodiversity, we use human appropriation of net prime productivity. There's a new articulation of a biodiversity boundary that came out in the third planetary boundary paper. This is 5.5 gigatons of carbon per year, just 10% of the Holocene value. And then the second one is ecosystem functional integrity. So we assess that if you want to maintain pollination, pest regulation, sediment, nutrient capture from production systems, that you need to maintain at least 20 to 25% semi-natural and natural habitat per square kilometer in production systems. And the per square kilometer one is important to us because when we look at pest control, when we look at pollination or interception of nutrients, if you don't have habitat that's proximate to production systems, the services simply aren't offered. Most of our pollinating or pest regulating organisms don't travel more than 500 meters. And so that proximity really is quite important in that measure. I'm going to go down to the freshwater biogeochemical flows. This didn't change significantly from 2019, 57 teragrams of nitrogen per year, 4.6 teragrams of phosphorus per year. The blue water consumption is 2,000 cubic kilometers per year. Probably a really hard boundary for us to assess because it's so regionally specific. And so I think the global value, masks, concerns about local transgressions of that boundary. And then finally, I think I want to focus on the novel entities, which for us is plastics, biocides, and antibiotics used in production systems. This is a really challenging boundary for us to assess. And to be honest, I'm still not completely satisfied with that work. The Planetary Boundaries team, the Earth Commission, as well as the EAT-Lancet Commission, have been trying to provide better guidance here, but the diversity of products that are used in agriculture really makes a systematic assessment difficult. So we really do urge more work on this novel entities boundary. Hope that you have some time to dive into this deeper, but we do hope these are important reference points, particularly for CGIAR staff to think about how do we manage production in a way that helps bring us back within limits. The second piece of the work was trying to assess, well, what's the food system share of current planetary boundary transgressions? So here you can see the planetary boundaries. The dark green is the current assessment of that transgression. This is taken straight out the planetary boundary work. The planetary boundary is in yellow. The orange one is the high risk line. So you can see that for 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries, that group has assessed that we've transgressed those boundaries. Johan Rockström and colleagues proposed at the UN General Assembly this September that the ocean acidification one has also been transgressed. So he did this after we had published this image, Stinker, even though he's one of our co-chairs. But then when we look at the other ones, what do we see? Well, we see that food really is the #1 driver of planetary boundary transgression. And this did surprise us, right? If I start at the top and go counterclockwise, food is 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. But food is 80% of biodiversity loss. It's 40% of current land occupancy. So we're within the acceptable risk, the high risk zone. It's about 75% of freshwater use. It's about 75 to 80% of modification of biochemical flow, so nitrogen and phosphorus. It's 25% of ocean acidification. And if we restrict the analysis to pesticides, biocides, and antibiotics used in agriculture, it's a major source of pressure of novel entities. And that last, I just want to be clear that we didn't assess the full scope of global novel entities, but restrict ourselves to those that are used in agriculture. So again, that's a value that requires further work. But when we look at this and we think about planetary boundaries, what we realize is that food production systems, which should be our most proximate relationship with nature, currently is one of the primary drivers of planetary boundary transgression. And when I see this as someone working for the CGIAR, it causes concern in terms of impact that we have. But on the other hand, I think it's a real opportunity to recognize that the work that we do determines whether and how we combat imbalances. How do we integrate that in the work that we do, and how do we articulate that part of our mandate is considering how do we bring systems back within these limits. We do provide downscaled maps for many of these for the geographers who'll be happy to see that we have these values for pesticide risk. This is our assessment of the risk scores. You see that it's quite high, particularly in agricultural production regions, lower in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So here, I think critically to think about how do we use these products to take care of threats, retain them as tools for farmers, but how do we move away from their use as prophylactic tools, right? And they are really critical ways that we work with pests and diseases that create critical tools for farming communities, but all too often they become just annual parts of production systems as a preventative measure rather than as a treatment measure. The second is nitrogen surplus, and I think this one's quite important for us in the CGIAR. We see that there's high transgression, particularly in Northern Europe, in India, as well as in China. We see areas, particularly in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, where we are within the threshold. And so for nitrogen, we think a big part of the opportunity is redistribution to still come back within the boundaries, but to also help us come back in to close those yield gaps, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America. So we don't advocate, not using nitrogen, but actually how do we use it sustainably? How do we make sure that the nitrogen supplied goes into plant production rather than becoming a pollutant within water systems? And I think also a key question that we also have now about how these nutrients are transported to cities through production systems and then lost again into marine systems. How do we close the loop between production and consumption as a major solution space, particularly for nitrogen? Biodiversity, which is the domain that I work the most on, 50% of the Earth currently is classified as intact. These are the dark green zones that you see here in this map. You'll see that there's quite a bias, particularly toward boreal and tundra regions, arid regions, Sahara Desert, Australian Desert, the Mongolian steppe, rainforest, particularly in Brazil, the Central Congo, and in Southeast Asia, are about 50% intact for that ecosystems. Significant loss, particularly in grassland biomes, temperate regions, and Mediterranean regions, where in many cases we have less than 10 or even less than 1% representation of these ecosystems. So the distribution of conservation effort is not equal. The red zones are the ones that I think also we, as people work in agriculture, have quite a bit of impact on. The red zones are, we assess our areas where there is less than 20% habitat per square kilometer. And so as people like SIG working in agroecology, our proposal is that these are areas where you can no longer count on ecosystem services. You can no longer count on natural pollination services. You can no longer count on natural pest regulation services. And also you can no longer count on habitat to capture and sequester nutrient loss or sediment loss from fields. How do we re-embed this habitat within production systems as a means of complementing other tools that we have in production? So again, as people in the CGIAR, two challenges for us, right? So rather than, I think that for me, the biggest transition is we used to think of conservation as something that WWF does. What this image shows to me is that conservation is something the CGIAR does. Right? Our capacity to improve productivity and yield is a key means by which we take pressure off of land conversion. Our capacity to integrate nature habitat into agriculture is a key contribution both to conservation, connectivity, but also a contribution to production practices. Again, a key challenge for us in terms of how do we integrate that into our work. This is an awful slide. I don't usually show it, but I put it in here for SIG. What we have is across in columns is planetary boundaries, so yield, nutrient sufficiency, water nutrient loss, soil organic carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, and pest regulation. In rows, we have production tools that we decide to call sustainable and ecological intensification. So we think that both the work that we can do to improve productivity with less inputs or less loss of inputs is a key solution, but also how do we bring ecology back into production is also complementary input. So we have practices that go from crop and non-crop diversification, organic amendments, reduce soil disturbance, rice ag diversification, fertilizer management, enhanced efficient fertilizers. And what we find when we look at this is that we can't find any evidence that production and sustainability are antagonistic to each other. Actually, most of the evidence we find is that there are across regions, across places, examples of where sustainability and production are working together. And I think most importantly, that when you look at these practices across the columns, is that many of the practices not only have positive impact on one environmental domain, but have complementary impacts across multiple environments. So I think, again, recognizing that many of the practices that we work on have complementary and synergistic effects across domains is really something that we want to celebrate and put more emphasis on. The newest piece of work, I'll share the slides with you, Laura. So the newest piece of work is Justice. This was led by Christina Hicks and Nitya Rao and a tremendous group of scholars. Shakuntala also contributed to this. We based our work on existing human rights frameworks. So one, recognitional justice, whose identities, whose values, whose cultures and experiences are acknowledged. And I think the CGIAR has really put a lot of emphasis on this over the past decade. Second, representational justice, who has a voice in decision-making processes. This has been really important for us in EAT-Lancet. When the 2019 commission came out, there was a lot of tension, particularly with the animal production sector. And I think one of the key things that we've done differently this time around by focusing on justice is recognize that, yeah, this is scary for many actors in the food system, and recognizing the transition does require engagement and working across domains, and recognizing that transitions does require taking care of people who are on the front lines of food production as well as food service. And then third, who gets what, distributional justice in terms of who gets what and how fairly are resources, risks, and benefits being shared. I want to add to here is how fairly are responsibilities being shared. So if you go back to the slide on the planetary boundaries, recognizing that much of that pressure comes from regions and individuals with unhealthy overconsumption. So I think this really shifts our narrative to thinking about not just how do we make sure that those who are hungry have access to food, but also how do those who are contributing to the environmental pressures recognize, think about, and act on their share of responsibility. We have as a fourth element of justice, freedom and agency, which Christina argues really transcends the other three domains. I'll go through these parts a bit quickly, but one, what we did is look at 4 indicators of justice. This is an area where we would encourage a lot more work. I think one of the challenges that we had here is data availability, the coverage of data across regions, and also the relationship between justice measures and the justice frameworks. We would encourage more work on this domain. So the right to food, the 2 indicators we used were affordability of healthy diets, and second, healthy food environments. For one of those indicators, particularly in food environments, we looked at sugar-sweetened beverages per day as an indicator of food environments and assessed that for a majority of the world's population, we live in areas where unhealthy food environments are prevalent. So how do we make healthy foods the default option in the places that would work? Second category that we used for our justice guardrails was the right to a healthy environment. 2 indicators that we used here were non-toxic environments and safe climates. As one example of that, looking at human environmental niche by 2070 or RCP 4.5 for climate people, again, identifying that too many people, the majority of the world's population, is exposed to unsafe environmental conditions. So we see this as deeply unjust. Third was the right to decent work, which includes measures of living wages, but also meaningful representation. One indicator that we used here, and I think this was probably the most challenging indicators for the group, was collective bargaining coverage, percentage by employees. You can see big parts of the world where we have no data. So I think here really calling on how do we begin to collect this kind of data in our own work? And again, too many people who are struggling with having a voice in employment. Finally, individual collective agency, which we quantified as freedom from corporate control, civil and political freedoms, and non-discrimination. And what I would like to maybe pause on is that, when we think about the interplay between these different rights, if we recognize that there's, of course, the right to food, which is well understood by many, but if food consumption patterns today are the primary driver of planetary boundary transgression, I think it does beg the question if we not only have a right to healthy diets, but also responsibility to it. And I think this really does, that kind of a narrative, that kind of a thinking does emphasize that there are actions that need to be taken across all countries and all actors. When we look at the distribution of both these rights and sustainability, and so what we look at here is the proportion of the world's peoples that are living in countries that are either unsafe with consumption patterns that are driving environmental transgressions versus safe consumption patterns that we would argue are both healthy and sustainable, versus places that have social foundations that are met and those that are unmet. Half of the world's population is in places what we would say are unsafe but just, that is, we benefit from important justice guardrails, but we have consumption patterns that put significant stress on environmental variables and planetary boundaries, and therefore that would not be safe. We have 2.7 billion people that live in places that we would qualify as unsafe and unjust, lack of social foundations, but also where consumption is driving environmental threats, and just 1% of the world's population that would be classified as places that are both safe and just. And again, for me, I think this changes a bit the narrative in terms of what we also work on in CGIAR, which I think often has been, when we think about food systems, how do you ensure access and availability to food to communities, particularly in low middle income countries, to recognizing that high income countries also have a significant role to play. So I think it really globalizes this food system transformation challenge compared to the more regional approach that we have. It at least recognize that all actors have a role to play. I want to go to the last section. The clock is reflective. And I say, okay, I see about where I am. But this is work that was led by Mario Herrero and Daniel Mason-Lacroix, who many of you know. Daniel might be online as well. I hope he is. But what I think that both of them did, which really was tremendous, is they brought together 11 modeling organizations. Sorry, this is a holdover from this morning's presentation. 11 modeling organizations, including our own impact model with IPRI, and challenged all of these modeling organizations to collaboratively, in parallel, assess the impact of moving towards healthy diets, reducing food loss and waste, and improving productivity. Important model comparison project, which I think provides us important results for the Commission, which I'll share with you in just a bit, but more importantly, increased capacity by a global network of models to be able to run these kinds of analyses. And then second is beginning to allow these teams to compare how their results compare to others, and is driving, I think, some deep reflections on model improvement. So we expect that for the 2030 Commission, that a lot of the variances I'll show you here will be reduced. But what do we see from this intercomparison? The orange is business as usual, percent change from today. The yellow is what would happen if we moved towards a healthy diet for all, improve production efficiency, which is a core part of our work here in the CGIAR, and third, reducing food loss and waste. Business as usual increases land by 4%, increases greenhouse gas emissions 33% from today, increases freshwater consumption by 13%, increases nitrogen phosphorus pollution by 41%. If we go back to the image on the planetary boundaries, from an environmental point of view, we would argue that business as usual is non-tenable as a solution. If we go back to the health impacts of Western diets, we'd argue that business as usual scenario also is non-tenable in terms of its impact on public health. Moving towards a healthy diets, improving production efficiency, and reducing food loss and waste, in contrast, would allow us to feed 9.7 billion people in 2050 with 7% less land. Mario would remind us that this would be the first time in human history that we feed more people on less land. Second, it would allow us to feed 9.7 billion people on 20% less emissions than today. We're able to reduce freshwater use by about 9% compared to today, still not below today's value, but I think significant reduction, and also primarily within planetary boundaries. It allows us to bring nitrogen phosphorus down to 15%. This is the hardest one for us to come lower on. And I think here, two additional projects that were part of the commission. One was analysis of regenerative or agroecological production, led by Sarah Jones and my team. And second, new work by Hanna van Zanten at Wageningen on circularity. Both of those models showed additional impacts that could come through investments in both agroecology, regenerative, and circularity. We don't include them in the model comparison because most global models can't handle them yet. We present those results with a bit of caution because it's one model compared to the 11, but it does show, I think, there are some rather important avenues for investment, both in terms of how do we recognize the capacity of agricultural landscapes to not just produce food, but also produce environmental benefits. And then what are the technological approaches that allow us to be more circular, whether it's reintegrating plant animal production systems or other means of circularity. It means a very different agricultural world than the one that we have today. And these are results that are difficult for many, particularly who work in the livestock sector. And I'm curious as to see how CIMMYT reacts as well. The width of the bars is the variance across 11 models. The white bar is the median value. Agricultural production grows by 8%. I had someone very high level in food present in China a month ago and say we need increased production by 60%. It doesn't square with the 8% that I see here. And I think that this is what happens when you begin to try to see our mandate in CGIAR from a food systems perspective, rather than strictly from a production focused one. The difference between our business as usual model in EAT-Lancet, about 38% growth, difference between that 38% and 8 is particularly the effort that you get from reduced food loss and waste. Second, what we're producing changes significantly. So 22% reduction in livestock, 33% of that coming from ruminant meat, 24% reduction from non-ruminant meat, dairy, about 7% reduction, crossing the zero bar. For crops, rice is about a 13% reduction, wheat about a 4% reduction. You see the variance in both of those crosses over above the zero bars as well. Coarse grains, about 3%. And then a big opportunity, particularly in vegetables, fruits, and nuts. A lot of discussions with Mario, Daniel, and the modeling teams about how do we disaggregate this in the next commission. I mean, that's a very broad category of crops that ranges from plantation crops, orchard crops, to crops that are grown, annual crops that are grown in horticulture with horticultural practices. Sugarcane, 7% reduction, and then fish and shellfish, a 46% increase, which again raises important questions on which fish and shellfish and with what production practices. We do have these results by region, and I think these are particularly important for us in CGIAR. Quickly to explain how Daniel might lay this out. So we have that's how it works. Whoa, trippy. Okay, so we have sub-Saharan Africa here, we have South and East Asia here, we have Europe here, and we have Central American production here. Business as usual is on the left for each of those. Oops. And then EAT-Lancet is on the right. And I'll share these with you because I think it's valuable to take a look at them. But when you see business as usual for Africa, massive increase in production across all food groups. When you see Lancet business as usual, it's still massive increase across all food groups. A little bit smaller, but still significant production challenge in Africa. And again, I think this is why we're investing quite a bit on this in the CGIAR. For South and Central America, 41% increase in agriculture and business as usual versus 10%. So it's a really big difference, again, coming from reduced food loss and waste. The distribution of these crops, you see rice and wheat, 20% and 45% for rice and wheat, business as usual, 14% and 13% when we look at EAT-Lancet. So still growth in the region, but much smaller than our business as usual. And if I go to vegetables, fruits, and nuts, particularly in EAT-Lancet world, 73% So I think rethinking, what are the commodities that we focus on, and how does the skill sets that we have as CGIAR help us to achieve some of these challenges? I did put in the figures for South and Central America coming from Daniel and Mario. So we just spoke about those now, but again, how to make these available, and Mario and Daniel and the modeling team are also quite happy to interact with you all. It does mean important impact on environment, right? So if we look at business as usual across the top, an EAT-Lancet world, second row, decomposed for dietary shifts, increased productivity, reduced food loss and waste. Across agricultural land, greenhouse gas emissions, blue water use, nitrogen and phosphorus. Business as usual, significant increases in environmental pressure in the region. EAT-Lancet world, we go from an 8% increase in land to 11% reduction in land, the majority of that coming from dietary shifts. For greenhouse gas emissions, 39% increase in emissions in the region under business as usual. An EAT-Lancet world, 38% reduction, with significant parts of that coming particularly from dietary shifts. So how do we, working particularly on the production side, integrate some consumption side challenges to be able to be better partners, I think, in both achieving the health needs that our countries are calling for, but also realizing that this also helps us achieve our mandate in bringing food back, food becoming a contributor to coming back with environmental limits. I'll skip these, but I'll share them with you. I think the main point here is there's really rich regional data that comes from the work that the modeling team did, and we want to make sure this is accessible and available to you. I want to move into the last portion, which is the focus on solutions and transformation. I find this is the hardest section for us as scientists to work on and write on. And I think this really requires deeper handshakes between us as scientists, policymakers, and frontline food system actors. When we try to understand what is the impact of solutions, I find that the research literature simply is not very rich, or at least it's not found peer-reviewed value, that we're often very much focused on understanding the impact of a single intervention on a single goal. Whereas when we talk to cities, when we talk to governments, they're bundling front to package label with the tax, with the school meal program, and that we're not very good yet at being able to understand the impact of bundles, particularly when those bundles are adapted to context and therefore often not the same across multiple regions. I think this is a real opportunity for us to see how we can engage more with these groups. We classify these and provide 23 solutions that are focused against 3 goals. 1, ensuring that we can ensure access to healthy diet for all. 2, making sure that the production of that diet is done within planetary boundaries. And so this is improving efficiency, but also improving integration and ecology within agriculture. How to ensure the right to decent work and safeguard social foundations. We do provide, again, 23 actions that we assess in literature having impact. I'll go over the middle part just to give you a sense of what they include. 1, shifting towards healthy diets. 2, protecting and promoting healthy traditional diets. If I keep going in a clockwise manner, implementing sustainable and ecological intensification. Halting agricultural conversion of intact ecosystems. Reducing food loss and waste. Securing decent work. Ensuring meaningful voice and representation, and recognizing and protecting marginalized groups. And I see capacity across the CGIAR to work on all of those 8 categories. And so I think this really presents both the challenge and an opportunity for us in terms of identifying what our contribution is to helping address these challenges. I'm going to skip this part and go to the end so that we have time for questions. And I think that the last point that I think we want to share is that when we talk or when we look at the current state of healthy diets today, the current state of food and its impact on planetary boundaries, the current state of just-in-food systems, we find all those values alarming. We're concerned that main trajectories are moving in opposite directions. But when we look at the capacity of healthy diets, food production, reduced food loss and waste to impact change, I find that really encouraging. So food really can transition from primary means of degrading environment to, I think, our best bet in terms of improving environment. It requires, again, the skills that we have in the room. So for us, food systems cannot be just without ensuring the planetary health diets or health diets, making it affordable and accessible to all, and without substantially reducing transgression of planetary boundaries, a lot of our work on climate. And second, we recognize that justice is necessary both to overcome barriers that currently impede transformative change, but therefore that justice isn't just an outcome of transformation, but that it's prerequisite to enabling it. I want to thank you for inviting us, for spending time with us. I do hope that this was useful. For me, it's a real honor to be able to spend this time with you here at CIMMYT, and I hope that we have some time for questions and interactions.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for these insights. And before we go to the questions, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Signat for a message. Doctor, please.
Well, I think we all really appreciate this opportunity to be taken through this EAT-Lancet report, and we very much welcome you here in the heart of the green revolution, but indeed a greener revolution, as we're all striving for, as you pointed out. And I think that we really would look forward to and be interested in engaging on getting this message out and on some of this thought pieces around particularly nitrogen, which is one of our areas of particular expertise at CIMMYT. And look, I don't want to take the prerogative of the moderator to jump into a question, but just be thinking about nitrogen. And, do we really actually have to keep going outside that boundary? Would be something I'd be really curious what kind of conversations have been going on around that with the work on BNI and BNF, moving beyond efficiency. But really, this is fantastic work and really important. The thoughtfulness, the engaging with civil society. And I really appreciate your challenge to us to thinking about bundling, because here at CIMMYT with our Mas Agro approach about catalysts, that's what we really find when we really meet farmers and communities where they're at, is that they need us to go beyond particular themes or approaches like conservation ag, but really to think instead about how we bundle and really meet farmers exactly where they're at. So this is just a huge honor to have you here. And we really look forward to a continuing conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. And now we have a message from Dr. Santiago Lopez.
Good. Thank you very much, Fabrice, for this presentation. I think it's very important for us as a CGR to be really engaged into this work, even though we can see that dietary shift seems to have a higher impact than agricultural innovation in general terms. But I think that it goes together. We can think of a dietary change when we have the agricultural production systems in place for that change. I think that the process of moving from just the planetary boundaries to going into the justice element is really a step forward in the 2025 report. I'm really glad to see that, because we have been talking about since the food summit in Rome. There was a lot of discourse on that we have to talk about justice, not only having enough food within the planetary boundaries. And I think it's really good that you managed to include it in a robust and scientific way. And I think that this gives us the opportunity for two things. One is going into a more, let's say, regional analysis. I like the regional analysis you had there, where we see that Africa will need to increase in any way production. Europe will need to generally decrease the impact of their agricultural production and diets. So at the regional level, and then if we can try to bring it down to our CGR center level. I see that CGR is prominent in the commission, I think that we as CIMMYT, we can try to really think on what is the role of CIMMYT into this needed transformation. Thank you very much, Fabrice.
Okay, so we now open the floor for questions from both in-person attendees and remote participants. Somebody have any questions?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a nice, compilation of. Oh, yeah, okay. I'm Velu, a wheat breeder based in CIMMYT, Mexico. So a lot of these recommendations, 50% vegetables and nuts and all these, it depends on the income of the people, right? So, for example, people still go for cereal grains like rice, wheat, maize, because they are cheaper or easily produced and processed. But it's not the case for many lower income people. So how do you see yourself in next 30 or 25 years? We can reach, everybody will reach the same level.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There was a lot of debate in the commission on this because we're concerned that cheap food is part of the problem. Particularly if you're working with our farmers communities. And also when we look at the environmental and health impacts, again, that's a major challenge. So the commissioners decided that what they wanted to focus on was purchasing power rather than on the cost of food. So we see the challenge as working on poverty primarily, and so increasing livelihoods to enable people to purchase healthy diets. We're not so those people who cannot afford, particularly the diversity of plant-based products, we find are living in pretty dire situations of poverty. So no amount of changing what a healthy diet is going to resolve that. We do see, fortification as an important intermediary step, but I think what we would want to articulate is that's an intermediary step. Right. And so how do we avoid dependencies on systems that don't have accessibility and availability of fruits, nuts, and vegetables? How do we increase demand for those foods that their prices do go down and make them more affordable? And how do we integrate in our long-term planning, the capacity to produce those foods in ways that are both productive and sustainable? I think, for me, as someone from the CGIAR, I guess I'm a little concerned. If I look out to 2050 and look at the production challenge, particularly in that category, how far behind are we in terms of trying to get the same gains that you've been able to achieve for maize and wheat for those other food crops? I think that research gap does scare me quite a bit.
I think here we have another question.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Silvanus. I'm a post-harvest specialist here, and I'm very happy that we have a second version of the EAT-Lancet report. I'm part of the 19,000 person that cite the report. So, and I was about to comment on that, but you finally mentioned food loss and waste at the end, and also. There was also a point that I was thinking of commenting on. It was about agency, and I understood that with the justice, this part of that. So I'm looking forward to reading the report. So I won't comment right now on that, but there is a point that I would like to raise and maybe hear about your perspective on that. I think many actors, particularly us, and maybe people from government and policies area, understand that we have to do something. We have to change something. And there are also big player. I mean, the agro industry that need to be involved. And these guys are the ones that moves many things, to be honest. We can provide a lot of evidence. We can do many things, but there are things that we are helpless. We cannot move these things forward if we have these big players that are not also pushing in the same direction. So I don't know if the report take this into account, But I would like you to maybe comment a little bit on that, because here in Mexico, for example, we have a lot of engagement with the private sector in terms of implementing regenerative agriculture. We have good model and many interesting that we can develop. But for example, from these pilots from this pilot to the whole supply chain, there's a huge difference, and we still need a little bit of push on that sense. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And in EAT, we actually very intentionally engage with the private sector, including actors that some people would consider risky for us to be engaging with, because we think that if you don't engage with them, then you're ignoring both a problem and the opportunity. We have created 10 communities for action. So when we published the 2019 commission, EAT took it upon itself to write a translation of what does this mean for farmers, what does it mean for cities, what does it mean for healthcare professionals. This time around, we invited those actors to write their own brief, including 10 actions they want to start, 5 actions they want to stop, and where they need help across from. So what we feel that we have now is a group of briefs that represent the voice from those sectors. It's for us, the sectors we engaged with more were on chefs, restaurants, and food service, and food retail and manufacturers. The farmer and fisher group was more represented by farmers and fishers, less by agro-industry. So I think, there is an opportunity there. One of the concerns of the commission, however, in the justice chapter in particular, is corporate concentration of power. And so the commissioners feel quite strong that the private sector has an important role to play, but is concerned about when that role is concentrated in the hands of too few. And I think in agriculture, this is a particular problem. And so how do we continue to engage with the private sector, support innovation? And I see huge opportunities for innovation, particularly in agroecology, regenerative, that I find fascinating. I think one of my favorite examples is, I think it's a Czech company that has a pest trap with AI that photographs the insects that they fall into the trap, relays information back to the farmer that allows them to make a decision. Do I need to spray? Do I not need to spray? So rather than using a pesticide as a preventative, you have information that lets you know that I need to use it as a treatment. I think that's a fantastic innovation that for me is both agroecological, but also, tech focused. And so that's a kind of collaboration I'm quite keen on. I think you guys have Chloe McClellan, is that the right name? Mm-hmm. So Chloe's work, I think when she looked at nitrogen, and how she very eloquently combined sustainable intensification and ecological intensification, so nitrogen fixation, we thought that was brilliant, and I think was the center of much of our discussions within the production side. And I think appreciate the way that she moved away from sustainable intensification or ecological intensification to really talk about the complementation between those two. We thought that was really brilliant. And again, a space for engaging with private sector rotations as polyculture Santiago's likes, and how do we combine technologies with our approaches? To me, that's a major investment space with the private sector. So I think that there's opportunities that we would encourage continued exploration for.
Okay, and just before your question, Dr. Knapp, let me remind our remote participants that they can submit their questions in the chat. Please, Dr. Knapp.
So much. I wanted to just follow up on that comment, which was super helpful. Chloe was a fellow and is just finishing a fellowship with the Zimbabwe team. So Christian Timfelders, who runs our regenerative agriculture, just for people's reference, it's really wonderful to see emerging leaders like this really improving the conversation and to have informed it. That's super exciting. But related to this, I am curious if the group has been thinking much about, instead of just saying, okay, let's improve efficiencies, nitrogen efficiency of Haber-Bosch means we're still taking fossil fuels and producing nitrous oxides, right? It's just saying that as a given, rather than if we rely more on nitrogen fixation. After all, 80% of what we breathe is nitrogen. So there's an excess of nitrogen. The problem is that we need active nitrogen, right? That plants can turn into protein that photosynthesizes and then supports our protein. Right. So we need that, but then it can be too reactive, right, into the system. But if we were able to shift more of the nitrogen to biological nitrofixation, which always comes with carbon, then, you know, some of the agroecology literature has shown you'd have mitigation there. And it's not just efficiency. You're actually doing synergy. And so I just wonder if it's just said, okay, we're just going to have excess nitrogen to some degree, which is what the global models currently say. And yet actually there's tons of biological evidence that, and same with phosphorus, right? Solubilizing phosphorus, only 20% of phosphorus is used and 30% of urea efficiencies. And even if you use the best 4Rs in the world, you can't get above 50. But if you switch to BNI, switch to BNF, switch to phosphorus solubilization, which could be through crop breeding. I mean, I really do feel that this could, you know, be a bit of a game changer, but of course I'm kind of showing my hand here. So just curious if you all have started that conversation, or that's obviously you have a lot on your plate already.
Yeah, so very much started it. And I think this is exactly why we talked about sustainable and ecological intensification, and why we found Chloe's paper important. Is that, you know, and for me, ecological intensification includes biological nitrogen. It's one of the environment ecological functions, and how does it get complemented with other sources. So the two together we found was quite productive. We're concerned. Well, so in terms of setting the environmental limit, you know, the production practices don't set the limit. So we're looking at practices that come within it. In Anna Norberg, that messy table I showed you, she's the one that assessed the practices. And so, yeah, very much from that assessment, we would say there is good evidence that these kind of practices not only allow us to close yield gaps, but have multiple environmental benefits. So I think there we want to shift the narrative away from sustainability and feeding the world are incompatible. We don't find evidence for that. And we find that this is a problematic narrative. Where we see, I think, a new area of investment, and this is where Mario and Daniel and the modeling teams are quite important, is that many of the global models that are hugely powerful for doing these global and regional assessments currently aren't able to work with these kinds of interventions. I mean, even no tillage, conservation tillage, that was one, I think one of the global models could, or was a specific assessment the PIC Potsdam's climate team did that was able to do that. Being able to segregate, plantation production from annual production, right? I mean, 150% increase in nuts to meet public health diets. We have no idea on how much land that is, how much above ground carbon that is. So those are our key questions. When we see our inability to close nitrogen and phosphorus, a big part of this is that the models that we're using now aren't yet fully integrating circularity options. And that's where Hannah van Zanten's work was really cool, in terms of saying there's something that we think is important here that you global modeling teams, should be thinking about how you integrate this into your assessments. And so a lot of the interaction between the modeling team and the environment and health teams, I think, is really of value, particularly the modeling teams, in terms of thinking about what are the interventions that we need to begin to integrate and incorporate into that modeling work. So a lot of our work now, and Mario and I'll be working on this on Friday, is really trying to see how do we bring frontline actors who are the ones who are thinking about solutions with the modeling team, so that one, the modeling team helps these groups understand the scale of intervention required, because we're seeing that cities, countries, and frontline actors, they just don't understand those numbers, that they're too big. So one, we want people to understand how far and fast we need to go. But on the flip side, the benefits of the modeling team is by increasing their proximity to better understand the kinds of interventions that we need to be able to integrate in order to feed back to them and say, yeah, the solution that you're working on does have potential at scale, or has potential in these places, but not in these, or has potential, but watch out, you might cause a negative impact somewhere else. I mean, one of the classic examples for me is, particularly on the diet side, that people who are working on fermentation protein, interesting climate solution, but often presented as, this allows us to achieve climate impact without people changing their food consumption habits. To me, that's a warning sign that that's a major investment with climate impact, but it's going to aggravate or do nothing in terms of health. And that's much less interesting for me than really trying to ask, how do we change behaviors, create markets that allow people to access healthy diets, which allows us to achieve the climate goals and the health goals that Juan, this is why Juan has us here, because public health is really concerned about the impact that diets has on public health in Mexico. So I think we need to be able to look at these objectives together. And that's where I think the innovations really become quite fun to work on as well.
We have another question from here. Okay.
Thank you so much, Fabrice. So just sort of building off of looking at, people have mentioned agroecological approaches, regenerative, I'm going to throw organic in there as well. And often as these are adopted by producers, they're then penalized by certification processes or reporting requirements to demonstrate that they aren't polluting or doing things that would diminish sort of planetary health and whatnot? And do you see an opportunity to incentivize those types of production systems? And I wouldn't necessarily want to say we need to penalize those who are using chemicals or fertilizers or pesticides, but sort of a paradigm shift in terms of how we value those systems and support them, because I feel like there's a lot of barriers to producers to be able to do regenerative or organic or agroecological production practices because of the steep cost.
I think there's a huge opportunity. I think intentionally in the commission, we avoided words like regenerative and agroecology because we feel that they begin to pigeonhole people into camps, and it's why we presented that table the way that we did with environmental limits and production practices. We don't care what you call it; we just want to see the impact. And again, this is why Chloe's work was so important to us, in that it wasn't about a label, but it was about the impact. In terms of incentives. Yeah, I think we're deeply concerned that many of the incentives that we see today are going to foods that are overproduced, driving for health, with practices that have important environmental impacts. So we don't think that you should be rewarding financially pollution. And I want to distinguish that this doesn't mean not using inputs. We're not talking about a no input system. We think inputs are absolutely important, but we think you should be incentivizing practices that produce. So if you're using public funding in particular, that public funds should be used to produce those foods that benefit public health, and also that benefit, public goods, habitat, climate mitigation, clean water, are all public goods, and that the practices that allow you to get that, are quite. They're available. They require greater investments, and that many of the existing investments would be able to have impact. I mean, Europe, 40% of the European budget goes to agricultural subsidies. And I know that we're often calling for more funding. I think what we note is that the money's there, but often it's not being used on what you might call a convergence agenda. So this has been a conversation which 5 years ago people told us, you were crazy, there's no way. People still think it's crazy, there's no way. But our conversations with WTO, we were with the 4 DGs of the European Commission last Wednesday, and it was a part of the conversation. We were with WHO and FAO this morning, and WHO was also beginning to call for convergence agenda. The UNFSS +4 stock taken status, I thought was discouraging from the point of view that Europeans were largely absent, European Americans were absent, and that can frame it as this is a challenge for Africa, but the Africans present, quite a large number of them were talking about how they had brought their ministries together on a convergence agenda. Nutrition for Growth, the Minister of Agriculture and of Health for Côte d'Ivoire was present, and they took the stage together and spoke about a joint agenda. And I thought that was really brilliant. The Minister of Agriculture said, yeah, my strategy is coordinated with public health. I'm looking at 3 major crop types. One, those crops like cacao that are my export commodities and that are about wealth generation in my country. I'm looking at my staple crops to ensure my country is food secure and staple. And I'm looking at diversifying into horticultural production because I want whole of diet. And this is what my colleague here in health is wanting me to work on. And I thought that was a really powerful example, and that they both came to growth together to make that case. I thought was a big step forward.
Okay, and we have another question here.
I will be brief. Thank you very much, Fabrice, for your very comprehensive report. Congratulations to you and your team, and thanks for visiting us. I have a question regarding the healthy diet and the comparison against the business as usual scenario. You didn't show it here, but probably it's in the report, or well, it's not a well-known fact. It's not only the business as usual does not only produce all these negative environmental externalities, but there's also around 800 million undernourished people and over 2 billion people that are moderate or severely food insecure. So when you do these assessments and you say, okay, everyone, is your assumption everybody consumes a sustainable diet? Healthy diet. The healthy diet. Everyone consumes the healthy diet. So I think you need to show then that additional societal benefit that it would have. Maybe the focus is too much. Maybe it came across this way in the presentation, maybe not in the report. It's more like, okay, we consume too much meat, we get all these heart attacks and we get diabetes, etc. But the opposite is also very true. Like at the same time, there's people who don't eat enough calories to begin with, and they lack some other essential like macronutrients. Yeah, and also I'm very much with the first question, how maybe you could say something on how, did you do any assessment? You have shown us one map, like on the, I think it was economic access to that healthy diet. Do you think, I know you also said it's like customized where you are. You don't say that's the diet that we all should eat, like Burger King or McDonald's, that's the menu, pick one. It's customizable. But do you see, like, is it really accessible to people in different parts of the world? I imagine, like, there could be many people living in very remote areas. They don't have good access to markets. Or even I heard if you're poor in Manhattan, right, you can only go to like convenience shops where they sell you potato chips and everything. So how accessible are these diets really for people? And I guess it's related to income. But not only, do you have any suggestions like you made in your very last slide, all these action points? Like, could you maybe just tell us a bit any of these points that relate to these elements? Sorry, it's maybe a long question now, and we can talk later over coffee.
No. Those. I mean, those are all really important. I'm Belgian, but I grew up in Los Angeles, and so I was scanning the LA Times last week, and they were talking about your last point. So this drone flying over the South Central Los Angeles, total food desert. If you want anything that resembles what we were talking about here, it's not accessible. So one of the justice measures was food environments, and the assessment is that too many people do not have access to a healthy food environment. And I think this is important. If we talk about Africa in 2 ways. One, there are people in acute poverty in rural areas that struggle with access, but urban populations that are also struggling with access, where you're flooded with unhealthy foods. I mean, female obesity in Africa is 46%. So I mean, our image and the way we talk about Africa, it needs to expand a little bit. But your first point usually is in my 2019 presentations. That was my opening slide. Right, 2 billion people are struggling with hunger and malnutrition and not able to access sufficient nutrients or calories with your 1,800 1,800 numbers. We do have a figure for that. And another 2 billion are struggling with disease related to obesity and overweight. So that's 4 billion people. That's half the world's population today, which in one way or another struggling. I find that an alarming number. The modeling does assume that people who are in the hunger category and micronutrient deficient category access healthy diet, and that we do address hunger and malnutrition as well. So it's both reducing overconsumption and improving access are both parts of those models. And I do agree with you that we maybe don't emphasize the second part enough.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. Thank you all for joining us today and have a very good afternoon.